How many people here have built something with AngularJS? Good, good. It's a good starting place, all right? So now a tougher question. How many people have built something with Angular, or what we used to call Angular 2? You may have heard it. Okay. So maybe, and this is a really small group, and I kind of really prefer these presentations. So if you have a question at any point, or if I'm not explaining something right, definitely feel free to raise your hand, stop me, and we can kind of have a chat, because I have a lot of kind of prepared content about and about the CLI and things like that, but I want to, as much as possible, tune it to what you guys care about. So I use those two terms very specifically. So I said AngularJS and I said Angular. And the reason for that is, so we started AngularJS back in 2009 as kind of a reaction to what was happening on the web at the time. So basically we had jQuery at that point. And we were really trying to take this web, which was a document declarative presentation format document markup language. We wanted to turn it into something a little bit more that allowed us to interact with the users, right? Because the reason we've moved from all these back-end server infrastructure things all the way to the front end, it's all about user experience. It's how do we run more code next to the user so that we have things like animations and transitions, so that the data is there before the user even clicks. And while jQuery is really good at fetching something or hiding something or toggling it on and off, it's not a really great way to build a full application. And so we started building AngularJS, as I said, back in 2009. A few years later, some really good things to happen. So AngularJS became very, very popular. So we actually have millions of developers that use AngularJS today, and hundreds of thousands of applications built in AngularJS across the web, which is really awesome. But what ended up happening is, as we started seeing it at this bigger and bigger scale, AngularJS started falling apart in a number of different ways. One was runtime performance. So everyone's kind of familiar with maybe $scope.apply and the digest cycle that was triggered. Well, basically what we're doing there is we were taking your entire application and evaluating all of the expressions within it. And then any time one of those expressions changed, we would need to run the digest cycle again and see if anything else had another side effect. And so we'd effectively be running this hundreds of times in order to do runtime change detection. And so one of the big things that we did in terms of realizing that we needed to rewrite was we switched from that scope and controller model over into a component model. So a Angular application, which is 2 and later, is really just a tree of components that exists on the DOM or within the Angular application at any given time. And then we do a single pass through the tree, and then we know exactly what's happened. And then we actually have what we call a development mode, where what we'll do is we'll run that change detection cycle twice. And if anything changed in between the first run and the second run, we know that you have an unintentional side effect, and we'll actually throw an error. We'll say, hey, you did something naughty here. Let's stop and figure out what happened there. So performance was really the kind of #1 reason. But then the second big reason that happened was that the web itself was changing, right? So we now have ES6 and ES 2015 and 2017, where we've got things like modules and classes. And so the web itself has really progressed. And what we did with Angular is we really tried to take advantage of that. So what I often say is that the application that you'd build with AngularJS, you'd build it. It would be really quick to start, right? You'd throw a script tag in the head, and then you'd want to build out some sort of structure. So maybe you have a couple of modules. Now I have a bunch of components. Now I want to minify and bundle my code. And so AngularJS applications got complex very quickly. So, but Angular, what we do is we kind of start with that complexity out of the box in order to take advantage of the best and the latest of what the web has to offer. And so what your AngularJS application used to look like after 3 weeks, that's actually what your Angular application is going to look like out of the box. So it was these kind of two reasons we realized, hey, we need to rewrite this thing. And so we started that a little bit about 2.5 years ago. And we finished that process with our kind of 2.0.0 release in September of 2016. Where we went from there is we knew that we wanted to continue evolving the platform, and we wanted to do that in a way that was very clear to all developers what was coming. And so we announced that we were adopting semantic versioning, which meant that every time we wanted to do an update to the platform, we were going to change the major, or that first digit of the version number. And in order to avoid this idea of going from Angular 2 to Angular 4 to Angular 5, etc., we said, hey, for most use cases, most content that's written today, just calling it Angular is going to continue to work, right? So if you're writing a blog post about some new feature that we release, try and call it Angular, because what's going to happen is every 6 months we're going to release a new version. And while that version may have breaking changes, we're really intending for it to be a very smooth upgrade cycle, and so that the principles and concepts that you've already applied are going to continue working. And so we'll talk about that a lot tonight. Any questions on that AngularJS versus Angular and kind of where we came from? Because I think that's important, especially because we have so many AngularJS developers here tonight. All right, so let's get started.
Excuse me?
Oh yeah.
I got a question.
Yeah.
Okay, now you are every 6 months you are going to release a new version of the
Yes.
Angular, right? Did you get any question from any of your customers asking that? Because when it comes to business, business matters about solving the business problem,
Yes.
not technical things, right?
Yep. So just as a point of background, I came from 15 years in the consulting world, or in the software development as an agency. So I'm very familiar with how do we ship features the fastest and the best way, right? Like maintenance is not always the top concern, right, in the long term. So I definitely understand that context.
Yeah, then what do you think about, because for an example, let's say if we develop something today with Angular 2 and so after 6 months if you move to some other new major version, so when you are going to upgrade it, are you planning to give some tools to straight away
Yes,
migrate?
Yep, and I'll touch on that tonight, so
Okay.
Great question. All right, so I'm going to jump in. So as I said, we launched version 2.0 after about 2 years in the making back in September, and the plan is right now, and plans can always change with software, I think we've all shipped software, so we know what that's like. But the plan is that next week we're actually shipping version 4.0. So as of right now, we're in RC3. And so what I wanted to do for you guys is I wanted to give you kind of an understanding of what's going into that, as well as kind of where we're headed from here. But I think one of the things that might help you guys understand how we're thinking about this version is I actually wanted to go ahead and do some live development here, and we can come back to this a couple times. But so what I've done is I just about 10 minutes ago typed ng Sydney, so I'm creating a new Angular project. Let me make this big enough so everyone can see. And so this scaffolded out a version of or an application using the CLI, using the latest stable version. So I think this is 2.49 as of right now, and I'm going to type ng serve, and then in the back I'm going to pull. You have to cd into the folder, it doesn't work. All right, in the back end here, I'm going to try and open that file. All right, so this is all live coding, so if anything goes wrong, please forgive me. That's the demo gods at work. Let's make this big enough so you guys can see. All right, so this is a very standard kind of hello world Angular application built and using 2.49. So if we look at the code, we're going to see a component here. It's got a selector, it's got a title. Let's just change this to ng Sydney. All right, so now I've updated that application, and I've got serve running in the background. And so what I should be able to do here is go to localhost 3200, and now we see the application, right? This is a live application. Obviously, it's very simple. But what I want to do now is I want to go ahead and kill this application as it's running here, and I'm going to run an npm install command. And so what this npm install command is doing is it's going and getting all of the packages that are included in Angular, and I'm going to get the @next version. So right now that's a tag in npm that's pointing at version 4.0.0, the latest RC, which I believe is RC3. Do you have a question?
Yeah, actually I have a question for that particular one.
Sure.
Are you going to do anything about not having to copy that npm install? Like, there's just so many packages.
Yes. So I'll talk about that a little bit more when it comes in the context of the CLI. All right. So now we have an application. I've typed ng serve again after we did all the npm updates. And now, once again, you guys aren't going to be able to see this. It's going to be a little bit small. But now, under the hood, we're running 4.0.0 RC3. So that was how easy it was to update, right? This is not the same RC process that we went through before we hit 2.0.0, where we had a bunch of breaking changes. And so this is something that we're really committed to in terms of making it easy to go from one major version to the next. So even though we've got this 6-month cadence we've established, we understand that it's all about how do we minimize the amount of work you have to do. And so a lot of people are comparing the amount of work between our majors to the same amount of work between going between an AngularJS minor, right? So going from 1.5 to 1.6, for example. So I think that's just a little bit of important context in terms of this is how easy we want to make it for everyone to update their applications. Yeah?
Would you update TypeScript version to 2.2?
I did. I updated TypeScript to @latest, which is 2.2 right now. But
okay.
you could have also upgraded to 2.1 or 2.2 or even 2.3, one of the betas.
Upgrade the TypeScript version, it won't work.
Correct, yeah. A 1.8, so I'll get into that. All right, so I've shown hopefully how easy it is to update from Angular JS or from Angular 2 version 2 to version 4, which is really our goal to minimize the amount of developer pain, because we definitely hear loud and clear how much kind of frustration it is anytime we break something. Anytime we change things, it creates additional effort for you guys without creating a lot of value. But our goal is really to flip that on its head and create a lot of value without a lot of pain. So I talked about this 6-month release cycle. So you're going to see 4.0.0 either next week or very soon here. And then in September, we're going to be doing another version. And this is just something that's going to keep coming. We're also doing, we're evaluating, for example, a LTS to help large companies that want to be a little bit less agile and are less worried about upgrading between kind of versions that are further apart and then want to group and batch that upgrade pain. So we are looking at that. If you guys have opinions on an LTS, definitely hit me up on Twitter or by DM or shoot me an email.
Is the CLI going to be the same version?
No, so the CLI is intentionally, it's a point of discussion. Right now the CLI is versioned separately, so we're headed towards version 1.0.0 of the CLI. That's where we're at 1.0.0 RC2, I think, right now. And so the goal is the CLI should actually continue working with 2 and with 4. And then the same thing with 5 coming, it'll work across versions. And so with it working across versions, we didn't want to kind of adhere it to the same versionings because it's a little confusing if I have to use the CLI version 5 to go from 2 to 4, right? It creates a little bit of confusion. But if we just say, this is the latest version of the CLI, and it works across these 3 versions, or something like that. Yeah. So what's actually, oh yeah.
Just a quick thing, I'm still on Angular 2.
Yep.
What about Angular 3?
Sure. I can explain that. So there's a technical reason and a kind of a made-up reason. So the technical reason is our router. It took us a couple tries to get the router right on the approach to 2.0.0. And so if you look at the package number, our router has been 3.x.x right now. So if you're running Angular 2.4.9, you're actually running router 3.4.9. And in order to bring those to parity, we actually had to skip a version. So that's the valid, logical, technical reason. The reason that I like to quote is that Mishko promised there'd never be an Angular 3. And so we have fulfilled that promise. And I think, also in spirit, he was correct, right? No one wants to rewrite the framework again. We want to continue to evolve and help developers, not force you guys to update or rewrite things again and again. So we looked at how easy it was to upgrade from 2 to 4. Why would I want to do this? Why do I actually care about this pain? So the first thing is we wanted to make version 4 smaller and faster. So we made some updates to the view engine, which I'll explain in a little bit. We've also pulled out the animations package. So animations were built into core before, and now that's actually separate. We've also done a lot of work on Angular Universal, which is our server-side rendering story. Obviously, like you identified and mentioned, we've now upgraded the Angular project itself to version 2.1. We were stuck on 1.8. And then we've also done some work to enhance the experience for ngIfs and ngFors when working with local variables. So I'm going to go through each of these.
Stephen,
yeah.
Does anyone work with Webpack and the packaging stuff as well as part of Angular 4?
Yeah, so maybe repeat your question.
I did hear somewhere, maybe it's wrong, but I heard that Webpack was quite complicated and Angular 4 was supposed to address that. I don't know if that's the correct statement.
No. So we use Webpack a lot within Google, and most developers that build with Angular are using Webpack because it's actually the easiest to configure. There's a bunch of different really good module loaders. So on one end of the spectrum, I consider Webpack probably the easiest. And then you take a step up to System.js, which is a little bit harder to configure, but it's a little bit more powerful. And then you take another step up and you go to something like Rollup, which is better at tree shaking, so you can get smaller bundles, but then it's, again, harder to use. And then you get all the way to the other end of the spectrum to what is called Closure Compiler, which is actually Google's compiler with really, really advanced optimizations. So you have to limit yourself to a subset of JavaScript, but then you get this really, really small bundles, like 50% smaller than you would normally with Webpack or Rollup. Angular is agnostic to these. We don't actually care what bundler you use, and we feel that the whole bundling space is going to change over the next 12 months because we now have this spec for module loading where it's like import blank from blank. So this is part of the JavaScript standards, but what hasn't happened is it actually hasn't been implemented in browsers yet. So as soon as it's implemented actually by the browsers, we're going to see the actual way that the browser wants to think about that and the way that the browser is able to optimize that, and then that will propagate back to all of these bundlers and they might change. And so, for example, under the hood of the CLI, we are using Webpack, but we don't give you access to any of that Webpack configuration. So we actually have a black box within the CLI because our goal is, hey, if we don't give you access to change any of this configuration, then as soon as Webpack changes under the hood, we can do that seamlessly without you having to update your applications. So Angular works great with Webpack. That's what I was just using.
On that, there was an export Webpack config file for the Angular CLI, like the last release, I think. There was like a way of exporting.
Yes, yeah, I will get to that.
The other thing was for the closure compiler. When I've used the Angular 2, I've had a lot of issues trying to actually run closure compiler alongside.
Yes, closure compiler is a very advanced use case.
Yeah. It was just kind of the way the TypeScript was implemented and what was coming out was a little bit not.
Yes.
All the annotations were missing.
Yes,
so
you will have lots of those issues.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Sweet.
I'll put the link for the GitHub issue that has all the fun stuff with that in the meetup page.
Cool.
Okay. So let me get into this list, and then we can kind of come back to those sorts of questions as we proceed and as they make sense. So the first thing we did was we rewrote our view engine. So a lot of people don't know this, but we actually have a compilation step in Angular now. So what we do is we take the templates, these declarative templates that you write with ng-fors and ng-ifs, etc., and we compile that into JavaScript. So it's actually VM optimized JavaScript where you say document.createElement, right? And what we're doing is we're rendering that in the fastest way possible. So in version 2, the generated code was about 10 times the size of your templates, right? So you write a declarative template, and then in order to do all of the wiring, all the dependency injection to get the variables, the code that it generated was about 10 times the size. And so this was an example app. This is actually from my personal blog. All of the generated code that I had was about 82 KB. And this obviously gets much bigger the bigger your app is and the more complex your templates are. But what we did in between 2 and 4 is we completely rewrote that view engine. So all of the generated code looks completely different now. But the idea is you should never have to touch, and you should never touch the generated code because it's just going to cause you problems. But moving from 2 to 4, so all I did was that same npm install command. And this really tiny application went from 82 KB down to 35 KB. So we went from 10x the size of your template down to about 3x the size of your template. And so this is kind of how we want to continue to evolve Angular, is finding ways for us to make the platform better without you having to change your code or worry about it. And so we're definitely trying to do this again in the transition from 4 to 5. And so one of our GDEs actually projected this out. So his application in version 2.4.6 was about 230 KB, and we got him down to about 170 KB. And so he projects that by version 5, he will be negative. So that would be really exciting. I don't think we'll get quite there. I think it's going to be a little bit more asymptotic. But this is kind of the goal, right? So another thing we did to make your application smaller is we pulled all of the animations code out of core. And so this is only about 37 KB, but we're looking at anything that in the platform that we can give you the power to decide, okay, how can I make my application smaller? And so what we did is we pulled animations into Angular/animations now. And so by default, Angular doesn't have any animations. So which means you save that 40 KB, which is a good thing for you and your users. If you don't use animations, you're automatically going to get smaller bundles. If you do use animations, you just take your app module and you import browser animations module. So that's pretty straightforward. That is a breaking change and it's worth mentioning. If you don't do this, you'll either get a warning or an error that says, hey, go add the animations module. The other thing we did is we shifted from TypeScript 1.8 to 2.1. There's a giant list of features that I'm not going to read and I don't want you to read. But the core theory is there are more TypeScript features that you can take advantage of now. All sorts of really cool things, and I'll talk about one in particular. But also, your compilation of your application is going to be faster. So better type checking, faster compilation. That's kind of part of the reason we did this transition. One specific thing that we did, and this is really important for larger applications, is TypeScript has some very kind of advanced optimizations where you can say, hey, instead of when I say this is a number type, don't let it be a number type or a null or an undefined. And so you can do what's called strict null checks, which actually prevents an object from being null or undefined. And so it'll add all of that type checking. And if you did this in your application in 2.4.8 or anything in the 2xx series, it would actually throw an error because Angular itself wasn't null safe. But as part of the 4.0 transition, we've now made all of Angular null check safe, strict null checks safe. And so you can now apply this to your application. And so this is actually really important, for example, within Google, where we apply all of these very rigid standards to ensure high code quality. Yeah.
When you did that, did you find bugs just by switching to like turning on?
Well, there's no bugs in Angular, so.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we found bugs. I mean, and this is actually, I talked to a lot of developers who, when they first see TypeScript, they're a little bit afraid, right? Because it's like, oh my God, this is a new language. Why are you making a new language? But if you get into it, what you'll really see is it's really just the latest and greatest of JavaScript, so the ECMAScript standards, plus types. And in most cases, and in most applications, the types are entirely optional. And so after a week of using TypeScript, you'll say, oh, wow, this is actually kind of cool. Like, it gives me errors that it never gave me before, right? When my component is referring to something that doesn't exist on my template, or my template's referring to something that doesn't exist on my class, it tells me about that. Wow, that's nice, right? Because as an AngularJS developer previously, that happened to me all the time, right? I fat finger something in my template, and now suddenly the connection's not happening, and I have no idea why, right? It's really hard to figure out, okay, why is this process not happening? Oh, I've got a dumb typo that I made 45 minutes ago. And then I wasted 2 hours trying to debug that. So things like TypeScript are very, very helpful for finding those things and debugging them. So how many people here have heard of Angular Universal? Okay, a few of you. So Angular Universal was a community-led project by a gentleman called Patrick Stapleton and Jeff Wepley. And what it was is it's this idea that you can run Angular entirely on the server side in Node or in ASP.NET, and then render the entire site or the state of the application out to a string and then serve it from the server so that the user gets a fully rendered HTML page from the server. And then what we do is we bootstrap on top of that Angular so that all of these kind of static HTML things become live and interactive. And so this was an awesome project. It's actually in use at a bunch of different big companies. Because it solves use cases like Twitter scraping, right, or search engines that don't run JavaScript like Baidu. And so this was a project. It kind of got stuck at Angular version 2.1. And so what we did is we worked with them to kind of adopt it, and we brought it into the Angular organization within Google in terms of from an ownership and kind of guardianship standpoint. Although we are open source, and so those kind of open contributions are still critical to everything we do. But what we did now is, instead of having this as a separate project that calls internal APIs, we've now migrated it into what's called Platform Server. So everyone here who's used Angular, you've probably seen Platform Browser, which is how we get this HTML renderer. But now Platform Server does the same thing, but renders it within a node context without any sort of head. And so from that Platform Server, you're going to get this render module factory method, which takes in the app module factory. So this is that compiled module, ng module that you have. You pass in an index.html file and whatever URL or whatever parameters that are coming from the users. And then we actually run your entire Angular application, and we figure out, okay, this is the final state of it, and then we give that to you as a string. And then you can cache that, you can send it down to the user, you can really do whatever you want with that. And so this is something really powerful, and this transition is kind of complete now. This takeover from the Angular team, or this guardianship from the Angular team, is complete as of 4, and so it's much easier to take advantage of now. There's a great demo here from Rob Warmalt that is in the bottom of the slides. And if anyone wants a copy of the slides, I will tweet them out after, so just follow me on Twitter. Yeah?
CLI, you support investment?
So we do not have support yet in the CLI for Universal. Part of the reason for that is how you want to run Universal is different for every user. And so there's so many different use cases because most companies want to integrate this into their own hosting infrastructure. So the question then becomes, what does it mean to be integrated with Universal? Right? So that's something we're still working through. I would love to see more support for the Universal in the CLI. But in general, it's really, most people are going to end up wanting to integrate it into their infrastructure, right? Your servers, your node environment, et cetera. And so these methods are kind of the underlying things that you need to do that. But if you have a specific need, like you say, hey, I wish Universal would be generated by the server and do this, right? Definitely either send a PR or chat with me and we can talk about that use case. All right. The last piece here that I want to talk about in terms of 4 is really an ergonomics change. So what we did is we took a look at the ng-if syntax. This was not in RC3. It's going to be in RC4, which should be launched as soon as America hits today. which is tomorrow, right?
Okay,
is that normal for you guys in Australia? Okay. Not the only one, though. So this is subject to a little bit of change, but it's pretty solid. Igor, Mishko, we've all had a bunch of meetings about this to make sure that we feel very good about it. So a lot of us have written asynchronous code using observables. And so if you do this and you want to do something like an if check for an observable first, previously what you would do is you would put your user observable in parentheses, and you'd throw question mark dot, and then another property, right? So you check to make sure the observable is resolving, and then you would check to make sure that each property is coming in. And then what you'd actually end up doing is you'd create like 6 different subscriptions to that same observable. And so if you're using HTTP, naively, it would make 6 HTTP requests to your backend, which is terrible UX. And there were ways to overcome this within your component if you went and unraveled the observable yourself, or forked it, or had something like share results, which is coming in RxJS. But that was really hard to do, right? It's a pain. Developers had to write a bunch of code. And so we believe we fixed this. And so we've added this keyword as, which will take whatever the expression is in the ngIf and save it to a local variable called user. And so if I have user observable here, I can pipe it through async and then save the results of that asynchronous unrolling in the user parameter. And then below that, I don't have to deal with the user observable anymore. I can just say user.name. And so we feel like this was a tiny change. Like this is like 8 lines of code within Angular, but getting it right, right? It's always making the right 8 changes in your code. And then also making sure that it's easy to use was very difficult for us. The other way that we've extended ngIf here, so we're going to take that same example where we have a user observable that we're unrolling via async and then saving locally as user. You also now have an else case. And so what I can do is I can create a local template variable. You'll see below this ng template. Sorry, guys. Where basically I'm taking an ng template and I'm throwing hashtag loading on it, which creates that variable. And then I'm referring to that variable in an else clause in my ngIf. And so what this will do is, if this observable is truthy, if the unrolled observable is truthy, you'll see the user's name in a div. If it's not, then you're going to see loading users in a div. Right? So this is something you could do before, but once again, if you had, for example, 2 ngIfs with the condition notted, then you'd actually have 2 subscriptions, which is kind of painful. So this is an example of how we're trying to make the ergonomics of Angular a little bit better based on community feedback. And because this is all based on what's called a microsyntax, where all of these actually have mechanical desugaring into how it works on the template level, you can actually extend this a little bit further, and we can use this in ng4 as well. So here we have a standard let user of a user observable pipe async, right? So this is, I'm going to iterate, this actually should probably say users, right? I'm iterating over a list of users. Oh no, that's right. User observables pipe async. So I'm getting both the instance of the item of the collection, and I'm going to save the collection itself. And then I can use this add syntax to get the index as well. So you could get indexes before, you could get counts before, but you had to use a little bit of an awkward syntax where you'd say semicolon let I equals index, which is not really intuitable. We feel like this is a little bit easier to use. So I can save the results of the expression. So user observable pipe async, that's going to be my users, and then index is becoming I. And then I can actually use this here, so I can access that item. So I can say here's the user's name, and then I can say which user of the total number of users they are. And I don't have to go and store these things in extra places and figure that out in my component, which is really good for developers, we feel like. I think that's the last thing I had on 4. There's been a bunch of other changes under the hood. A lot of these have been marked with deprecation, so your code will still work today. So for example, if you use template tags anywhere, you're going to see a deprecation that says now use ng template. The reason behind that is we wanted to be more compatible with web components, which template is actually an HTML standard for web components, and so we wanted to get out of that namespace. And then you're also going to see things like TypeScript's object types are going to flow better. So now we can actually get the type of an object from a collection using ng4, which is kind of exciting. So again, more of these cases where if you had a bug in your code before, now it's going to start throwing an error, whereas before it would just fail silently and you'd experience really weird behavior at runtime. So that's the section on 4. I think we're really excited about it. We feel good that it's not going to break developers. We've been testing now for, I think, 3 weeks. And we've got kind of several hundred people. I think there's, at last count, 200 sites that have already launched using 4, or 200 domain names. So that's pretty good. and it's just going to kind of, we hope to keep getting better from there. So the second half of this talk, I wanted to really dig into the CLI, because the CLI is kind of emerging as the main way that people use Angular, or at least I'd say about 75% of people use Angular, because of the way that it helps scaffold, it helps you get set up in the right way without having to think about the tooling that can go into these very complex kind of JavaScript ecosystems. So I said 70%, but how many people here are using the Angular CLI today? Okay, about 50%, so we need to get 25% of you on board, and that's the purpose of this talk. So I'm going to go through just briefly kind of what the CLI is and what it does. If I'm going too slow, feel free to tell me to go faster. If I'm going too fast, same thing in reverse. The CLI does a bunch of things, but these are the kind of core 5. So the first thing it does is it scaffolds. So that's how do we get set up with a new project? How do I get the testing infrastructure, all of those things that I need? It will generate new things for you. So everything from models to modules to components. It will serve, so it'll give you that kind of dev cycle workflow. It will help you build your application, and then it will also help you test your application. So let's jump in here. So scaffolding. So anyone who has not used the CLI before, I recommend you type npm install-g at angular/CLI. We used to call the CLI used to be scoped a little bit differently, but we've moved it here to be consistent with all the rest of the Angular packages. And then once you have the CLI globally installed, you're going to type ng new and give it a project name. So the example that I just did a few minutes ago was ng new ng-Sydney. So that was the name of my project. And then what it did under the hood was it actually went and it took a blueprint that we have saved, which is a little bit similar to seeds, right, that you see all over the place for Angular or for any JavaScript framework. And then it replaces all of the variables in those files based on the settings that you give it, right? So there's a bunch of command line flags that you can give it that are discoverable via help. And then it makes that your Angular application via that seed. So it's a seed configuration tool to some extent. In those blueprints, you're going to see all of the best practices from the style guide. So on Angular.io, we have the style guide of like, how should I lay out my code? When should I be putting spaces between my components and imports, things like that. And so we tried to manifest all of those style guides in those blueprints. You're going to see all the dependencies you need to do all the appropriate testing and building. You're going to see all the TypeScript configuration. So if anyone's worked with TypeScript before, there's a lot of configuration options, and we're trying to just hide all of that from you or make it so that you don't have to worry about that. And then also environment settings. So using the Angular CLI, you can actually have a bunch of different environments. And then what happens is you can pull that in, and we'll swap that out at build time based on the environment you're targeting. So if you type ng new ng2 here, it's going to say installing, and then it's going to create all those files, and then it's going to run all of the npm install commands or yarn install commands we also support now. And so the actual scaffolding of the app takes about a quarter of a second, and then the npm installs, which we all know takes several minutes after that, which is kind of frustrating. I actually did a test where I set up a local mirror of out of this, and it's going to be so much faster, and it was actually slower. So npm is hard. Yarn, I think, is a helpful thing, but I think Yarn is still a little bit too young in many use cases. Sounds like you've run into some issues. All right, so that's scaffolding, right? That's getting the code onto the machine. But then we actually have a lot of tools for generating things. If we want to, I can actually demo a lot of this for us. So generating ends up taking a number of different forms. So as I said, we can generate classes. So that's just a pure ES6 class. Components, directives, enums, modules, pipes, and services. A lot of people ask me about routes. Why don't we let people generate routes? And this is something we did in the past. But what ends up happening is the complexity of a route, it's almost faster to code it than it is to generate. Like to write a big long command line to get the route right, it's just the same number of characters, just put it in your configuration. So we remove that. If someone has a great use case, let me know and we can take a look at adding that back. But what actually ends up happening, so I type ng generate component, and then I give it a name such as header. And what's going to happen, or you can also do an ng generate of a module, foo, and then you can do things like -- routing. And then what we do is we look at the actual contents of your application, and then we try and add that in the right place. So for example, if you're adding a component to your application, so you're saying ng generate component, we're actually going to look for the nearest ng module and automatically add it to that module. Right? So if you have a big modularized application with lazy loading and all these really cool things, the CLI is trying to do the right thing in terms of putting and wiring up your components in the right way. All we're really doing here under the hood is we're running JavaScript code to modify all the references, And then we're installing that blueprint in the same way that we did with the scaffolding, right? So we have these blueprints for all these things that you can generate and all these flags, and all those do is that sets variables under the hood. So part of the kind of purpose of this talk with the CLI is to explain the CLI is very powerful, and I highly recommend it, but nothing it's doing is magic, right? It's not a scary thing. It's not doing anything super intelligent or super complex. We've just worked through all of the edge cases for you, which is hopefully very, very helpful. The next thing, and almost the first thing that I always do after creating a new project, is serve. So we have this command ng serve. It'll pop up on port 4200. And what this will do is this will do an incremental rebuild process so that every time you hit save in your IDE, it will refresh using live reload on the browser, which is, for any sort of development process, this is kind of the holy grail, right? That every time I hit save, everything new pops up. And there's some experimental support for hot module reloading, but between the betas and the RC of the CLI, we've actually gotten the rebuild process so fast that most people shouldn't need hot module reloading. So what's actually happening under the hood of this dev server? So the first thing we're doing is, if you have any compiled CSS or transpiled CSS languages like less or SCSS, we'll do all that for you. We'll take all of your TypeScript and turn it down into ES5. We're going to do the bundling, so we're going to take however many files you've got, we're going to pull them into a single package, as well as do that with all of your libraries. We'll do that with your CSS as well. We'll do asset optimization, so if you want us to, we'll figure out, okay, how do we take these assets and make them smaller? We actually use a virtual file system, so if you're ng serving, it's not actually going to hit your file system, it's just going to be in memory and then being served from there. As I said, we've got live reloading. We're using WebSockets for that under the hood. And then a very cool thing it does is code splitting. And so I love to demo this because anyone that's built a lazy loaded application where we, at some point in our application, go and get a bunch of more JavaScript code and then import it into the current context, that's a very complex process. And we've done a really good job of making that easy in the CLI. The other thing, so now that we've served, now I've coded my application for a few hours or a few minutes. I've made the changes I want. Now I want to ship that somewhere. I want to push it out to the world. So we have this command, ng build. It's pretty predictable. And you can throw it the -prod flag, which is going to do all the additional minification of stripping comments, inlining things as appropriate. And it's going to give you a very portable /dist folder that then you can put kind of anywhere, whether it's your own Express server, Heroku, whatever you want. And so this is an example of what it looked like. So it just takes all of the assets, renders them out into that folder, and then says, hey, it's ready. Build, it's going to do all of those same steps that we talked about. So it's going to compile the SCSS, the less, it's going to do the TypeScript transpilation. It's also going to do this process of ahead of time compilation. So I talked about how we take your templates, your declarative templates that are HTML, and we turn them into JavaScript or VM optimized JavaScript. We have two modes. We have JIT mode, which is what we're going to run by default because it's faster. And then as soon as you want to build a production build, we're going to run ahead of time compilation. And the reason we do this is because then you can leave all of that compiler code out of the JavaScript bundle that you ship down to the browser, making it much smaller, much faster.
Production flag.
-prod does, yes. So as of beta 29, we added, so we used to have two flags. We used to have -prod and -AOT. But we felt good enough, and the feedback from developers was good enough that AOT is now easy enough, and so we added it to the -prod flag. So anyone that's shipping a production build should be doing AOT. Yeah.
How much does AOT save in terms of the final bundle size?
So it totally depends on the size of your application.
Okay.
So basically what ends up happening with AOT is we leave out the compiler, which I think is like 300 KB, 300 to 400 KB.
It's quite big.
But then it adds on top of that the generated code size, which used to be bigger and now it's much smaller. So we cut more than half of the generated code size between 2 and 4.
Sweet.
But AOT is really important for performance too, because we were actually doing all of this compilation in AngularJS as well. You just never saw it, because what we would do is we would take basically your templates and all this kind of rendered JavaScript, and we would pass it into an inner HTML element, and then the browser would have to parse it and figure it out. And so now it doesn't have to do that. It's all doing that at build time instead of at runtime. All right, and then the last piece that I want to talk about in terms of what the CLI empowers developers to do is testing. And so the Angular team is relatively opinionated, and when we talk to a lot of companies, this is actually what they like about Angular, where we've actually said, hey, these are the best practices, these are the standards, here's a suite of the tools and libraries that you can use, and they're all going to work together well. And one manifestation of that is that when you ng new a project or when you scaffold something out, by default, we're going to give you a bunch of tests for it. And so I know most developers don't like tests, don't use tests, but because we give these things to you kind of for free, you can either just delete them yourself, or you can maybe hook them into your CI and just say, hey, does my application build, right? Give me a baseline. Does my application still work at all? And then maybe you can use that as a stepping off point for additional quality metrics as your team grows and as your application grows. Because these are things that are much harder to add later, as we all know, right? So starting with them baked in kind of sets you up for scaling, sets you up for growth. Relatively simple. So we use Karma under the hood for unit tests. So if you run ng test, we're going to run all the tests. So it's going to go and look for all the spec files in your application. And if you run ng end-to-end, it's going to use a tool called Protractor. And that's going to actually spin up Chromium or Chrome, and then run on top of that all of the application and look for the things, do all the button clicks for you, and then look for making sure that the page is rendering appropriately. So we're actually standing on the shoulders of giants here, so we're using Karma under the hood, as I mentioned. And Protractor is actually another Google project that was built for AngularJS and works really well with Angular as well. All right, so I did a tiny bit of live coding already in terms of the transition from 2 to 4. But I wanted to at least offer and say, would you guys rather go into Q&A or more live coding? See maybe how to do like lazy loading and bundle splitting and all that. So who wants to switch into more Q&A? Okay, who wants to see live coding? Okay. Easy choice.
Who is torn between the two?
Well, there's always more time for Q&A, right?
Sure, yeah. Live code.
All right.
For more beers.
For more beers. All right.
NG live code.
So, are we still NG serving? I think we are. So this is our sweet NG Sydney app. Because I didn't prep this, because it's all live, I want to actually now add material design, because I think I'm terrible at design, and if I can use material design, that will help me a little bit. So I'm going to do npm install Angular material. Once again, I apologize. I'm blocking a lot of you guys. I don't think I can move anywhere. So,
Stephen, how mature is material design for Angular 2.5?
So it's in beta right now. What I say is that it's very, very stable and mature. Or it's very, very mature, I'll say. It's very high quality. The project lead, Jeremy, the material team is I think it's like 6 or 7 people right now. And so he has very high quality standards. And so before he lets a release out the door, he makes sure that it's very, very good. But the reason he's hesitant to call it 1.0 or final is because they still want to validate it at kind of various scales. And they still haven't finished all the components. So yeah. What is there is very good. I use it in every project, and a lot of developers use it in projects, but there might be changes over time.
Yeah, because when I tried Angular 2, it had about 3/4 of stuff there, but not all of it.
Yep. Yeah, that's still true today. So I think we have something like 24, 25 components, and I think the ultimate goal is like 40 or something like that. But the ones that exist are very good. In particular, we're working on more kind of, all the basics are there for material design. We're working on more advanced things like date pickers now. And like data tables. So, and then there's a lot of other options for those, and you can kind of mix and match. So, all right, my ng serve or my npm install command worked. So let's go ahead and add material design to my project. So I'm going to go into my root component, and I'm going to import the material module from Angular material, and then I'm going to go ahead and import material module. So we debate about this as well, because this is really bad for performance. You should, when you do this, import only the things you need for material, but I don't know where we're going to go, so I'm just going to do this for now. Do you have a question?
I was going to say, can you write tests as you go along? Like with Angular CLI, maybe?
Write tests?
Yeah, like TD.
No, I cannot. You may be able to.
I'm just interested to see how it works, that's all.
Well, I mean, so what's happening is, as things get generated, they come with tests. That's basically the extent of it.
Oh, Angular CLI does that automatically?
Yes. Mm-hmm. So when we created this application, the app component came with, the app should be created, right? It should create the app. It should have title app works. So we've actually invalidated this test, right? It should render a title in an H1 tag. I'm about to invalidate that test. So
it automatically generated all those tests?
Yes.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. And I mean, they're not good enough, but they're a starting point.
Do you gather metrics on how many people actually write more tests than just the 3 that you generate?
I don't have that, so privacy is very important to Google. So like, we don't actually have any. You guys are laughing, but it's very hard to collect any new data at Google. So I, as a person on the Angular team, we can't say, hey, we want to collect who's using what on the CLI. That has to go through an extensive privacy review. So we don't actually have permission to collect any data.
I was suggesting it wouldn't contain any information because it would be very few people would probably write. It was a disingenuous question.
Okay, so collection null set. How many people are writing tests, right?
Yeah.
Actually, I managed to get several teams that normally would struggle with JavaScript to write unit tests for every single Angular line they could pretty much using the CLI. I can talk to you more about this later, but yeah.
Maybe I'll talk a little bit about our release quality, and this is a departure from the demo here, but when Angular, how Google builds code is we use what's called a monorepo. So all of the code within Google is in a single repository. So millions and millions of lines of changes every few minutes, or I don't even know the metric. Very, very fast changing code from tens of thousands of developers, all in one repository. And so when we build a version of Angular and release it, every commit to master that happens in the Angular repo actually gets synced into our internal repository. And what happens is, in order to submit code into this big repository, all of the tests in the entire repository have to pass. And so in order for us to break someone, if we want to do a breaking change, we actually have to go and fix all of those projects. So there's more than 100 projects within Google that are using Angular already. And so we know when something's working. So if we ship a version of Angular, it's already in use at all of Google. So that it's kind of a quality concern that a lot of people don't know that we're already doing that. And so the only way to be defensive and to understand when we break other people's code is to have a lot of tests, right? Because when you have this massive code base, that's the kind of solution to that problem. Yeah.
What sort of load loader you using at Google? How you loading models?
So we use Closure Compiler.
Okay. Is it like a custom kind of mod loader?
Yes. So I mean, a Closure Compiler grew out of this Google skill problem of like, hey, if we can make our JavaScript 8% smaller, that saves lots and lots and lots of money.
So you're not using Webpack? And...
So internal, we're not using Webpack. We're using Closure Compiler.
Now, say internally, if you are using Angular, for your internal applications, now say when you release a new version, I think probably you may convert that your old application, say Angular 2 to 4, you convert it to 4, right?
Yeah, so everyone in Google's already running on 4, and they have been running on 4 for months.
Okay, then my question is, now, do you use any internal manual testing team to test your existing applications?
So,
you know that what I'm saying is because...
So, I don't want to go too deep into how Google works, but
no, because I am asking this question because usually because I work for a financial company.
Sure.
That most of the time, you know, that when you are going to say if you release a new version, if you ask, okay, we want to move from 2 to 4, we want to upgrade this to 4, that question coming from management is, okay, how much testing effort you need to put into this one? No, so manual testing.
So manual testing exists, but we rely primarily on really good automation.
Okay.
Because that's the only way you can survive at the speed that we move. I mean, a great example of that kind of one version policy was that, do you guys remember Heartbleed, the SSL vulnerability? So because we only have one version of SSL in all of Google, we fixed everything in about a week. So imagine if you had 600 projects with different versions of SSL, patching that out of every single version would be a huge nightmare, right? And so it gives us agility. All right, back into the demo. So I'm terrible at design, so I'm going to import this tiny little CSS sheet. So I'm going to go into the styles.css file here. And what I'm doing here is I'm just resetting the padding and margin, giving a couple margins, and I'm importing a style sheet from the material project. And so now that's installed, or that should be installed, and so we should be able to use it. So I'm going to swap out this H1 for an empty toolbar. I'm going to give it a color. Hey, look, it's not as terrible looking as it was before. Hooray! Thank you. So now let's actually try doing something interesting. So there's not a lot of code in here. Let's say I want to create 2 different routes. And instead of just creating 2 routes, I'm actually going to create 2 lazy loaded routes. And so the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to create a couple different modules. So let me just pop a tab here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to first say ngg module, and let's create an about module. And so once again, this is going to create an ng module for me. And then let's go ahead and do the same thing with maybe a stats module, or who am I? So I've created 2 new modules. You're going to see these in the source code. They've got their own folders here. So they've pulled in all the dependencies that you need. It's got an import of commons, or common module. And now what I can do is I can go into each of these and create source app about. And I can say, just like I said before, it knows where we are in the tree. So I can say ngg a new component. And in the about module, I'm going to create an about component. Don't criticize me on the naming here. And then I'm going to go into this who am I folder, and I'm going to say ngg a who am I component. And then when we look back at the code here, you're going to see it's created component folders in here with their own CSS, HTML, and again tests. But we're going to quickly invalidate these tests. And then it's also said created a template. So who am I works and about works, right? So just very simple things ready to get me going here. So what I want to do now is I want to actually lazy load this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my app module, and I'm going to pull in the router. And because we're at the root level, I'm going to say for root, and I'm going to pass in an array of paths. So the first path, actually, we'll just call this about. I'm going to say load children. And so load children is the way that we say, hey, this is a lazy loaded boundary. Don't actually go and load all of these children right away. Use this file path that I'm going to give it to go get that. So I think it's about/about.module pound about module. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing with who am I. So I'm going to say path, maybe who am I is a default. Load children. Who am I? Who am I dot module. Who am I module. And I have to just double check to make sure that I capitalized who am I. Yep.
Is that a hash who am I module? Or
yes, you're right. Yep, thank you. All right. And then just because I'm a stickler, I like things hierarchical, so I'm going to just move that up. All right, so so this is now, it knows how to load those routes, but they don't actually know how to render themselves. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to put a router outlet here, so that we know where we want to render it. And then I'm going to go into each of these modules and give them what we want to render. And so again here, it's just going to take an array of routes. And in each case, I'm just going to say path empty, component, and I'm going to point it at my who am I component. So that should work for who am I. We'll do the same thing in about. That's all right. All right, so let's follow the path here. So we've got an app module, and in this module we've defined 2 routes, the default one, and if you type /about, and then in each case it's going to load the code for that module via lazy loading. And so what we do is we've actually built a Webpack plugin called ngTools that you can use yourself, or it's used automatically in the CLI, which will see these, and it will automatically generate a separate bundle for these modules. And so we'll see that in a second. So we know which module we want to load, and we know where we want to render it in this router outlet. And then each module knows, hey, I want to load my component. So let's go ahead and ng serve this. And so now instead of generating the simple code we were before, now we're going to generate with a couple extra chunks. So 0.chunk, 1.chunk, that looks good so far. And by default, we're pulling in who am I works. And if I go to network here and I make it big, we should actually see 0.chunk. So this is that tiny, tiny bit of code. I think it's something like 4K for a small application. And it's pulling in just the code that you need for that module. And so this is kind of one of the more advanced patterns that we really recommend is lazy load lots of different routes so that whatever page the user hits, they're not paying the performance penalty of loading a bunch of code they don't need. So an example of that is don't pull in all of Firebase on your homepage. Just because Firebase is about 400 KB, and if you can save that for when a user actually needs to be interacting with that content, they don't have to pay that penalty until later, which is really good. So the other thing we didn't actually do is you can't actually navigate here. So let me just quick add some navigation. How are we doing on time?
5 minutes.
We have 5 minutes left?
We're 10 minutes over. Let's give it 5 minutes.
I could do this all night, so you'll have to stop me here. So. Or who am I is our default route. What was it about? All right, so now we should have 2 links. Yeah, spelling, type. Who am I? About. And you can see the URL bar updating. You can't see the URL bar updating if you're over there, but it is. These people will vouch for it. All right, so that was a relatively difficult thing to do in just pure JavaScript that we've made really, really easy in Angular. Let's cut the demo there, and we can move into a short period of questions. Otherwise, I can be around after to chat with anyone. Thank you guys so much. Yeah.
I know a lot of people might know the answer to this, I don't. So a lot of the stuff we use are Angular 1 directives, third party. If you're using Angular 2 or 4, how are you, do you have to actually upgrade? Can you still use third party directives that haven't been upgraded to use Angular?
So you can. So what I would say is the best and the most used component libraries have already announced support. So whether that's like ng Bootstrap, whether that's Ionic, PrimeFace, like all of the top tier component libraries from VMware, Teradata, Progress, etc., they're already supporting Angular. If the library you're using, because there were thousands and thousands of libraries for AngularJS, you can use them, but I don't necessarily recommend it. So what you would be doing there is you'd be using what we call ng upgrade, where we bootstrap both AngularJS and Angular at the same time, and then AngularJS can pull in components from Angular by downgrading them, and Angular can pull in components from AngularJS by upgrading them. And so you can kind of mix these and match these, and they work together really well. But I only recommend that for short periods of time during like an upgrade process or migration.
Yeah, because we use what we do, we'll have like a tree directive. I don't know if you can get those now, you might be able to. But we are heavily dependent on those sort of things, and that was a major stumbling block. Yeah.
Sure.
With the CLI, when you choose which version to use with the CLI, when you decide that?
So the idea right now is that you would always use the latest version of the CLI, and it will, yeah, you choose which version you want to create, yes. Yeah. So by default right now, it's using version 2. If I say ng new, ng Sydney 4, and I say, I think it's -ng4, that will build a version 4 project. Yep, and as soon as we release 4 as final next week or whenever that comes, we'll automatically start defaulting to the new version.
Okay, so we'll default to 4 next week.
Yep.
So you actually specify 2 if you want to do 2.
Yes. Why would you want to do that?
It's a long time.
Because we're actually backward compatible. So any components written for 2 will work in 4.
Right.
So materials controls. So I heard somewhere is WCG compliant, is it?
W3C.
So do you know the screen readers?
So we do spend, I don't know the screen reader accessibility standards, but we spend a lot of time making sure that they are screen reader and assistive technology compatible. One of the ways we do that is actually getting out of the way of the browser. So for example, we used to have an MD input component, which we put in, it would be we would compose an input field inside of that, but that was actually getting in the way of those assistive technologies, and so we stopped doing that, and now we have an MD input container that you put around a native input. And what happens, because we're using that native input, it will just work in any assistive technologies. So we do care a lot about making sure that, because a lot of companies have like compliance requirements or legal requirements.
That's painful. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, it was funny. I spent the day with Rob Dodson, who, I don't know if you guys know him, but he's a developer advocate who works on things like accessibility. And so he's spending a lot of time thinking about that and working on that to make sure that Google across the whole company, whether it's web components, whether it's Angular, or doing accessibility well.
So I'm counting on that will save us a lot of time, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Definitely come up after.